So, friends, this has become our Beth Meyer tradition, one I'm very proud of. This next section of our Musaf and Yom Kippur, so to speak, our rabbis, Chazal, our rabbis of old, our great sages, they kind of want to take out all the possible ways to appeal to God's mercy and God's compassion. So in this Amidah, in this section, there are prayers we do, like the Great Aleinu, or the Unatana Tokef, that bring out every opportunity to say to God, please have compassion on us, have mercy on us, hear our prayer, listen to what we're saying. The section that's traditionally recited during this, and if you'd like, during the break, you can look at it, review it, it's worthy of study in its own right. It's called Ela Eskara, of these I remember. And it's an opportunity for the rabbis to bring out great sages of the Talmud who suffered and were martyrs and were killed in insidious fashions by the Romans in particular, just because they were Jews, because they were rabbis, because they insisted on studying the Torah, they insisted on keeping our tradition together. And in that prayer, in that statements, the idea is theologically that we say to God, God, listen to us on Yom Kippur. We are saying to you, we command from you, we demand from you, listen to us, because of all those who have suffered for your name and for just being Jewish. But as we said before, we do not need to go back 2,000 years, sadly, to find those in our world, in our people, in our own congregation, who have suffered simply for being Jewish. Thankfully, we still have some Holocaust and Shoah survivors still in our community. But sadly, as the years go by, we know, just due to time, many of those survivors have passed away or are leaving this world. So we rely at times on the next generation, or even the generation after in this case, both cases, to help tell that story. And to say to God on this Yom Kippur, listen to us because of the various ways we come to you with our own pleas and our own desires, but also for those who lived and sometimes died for your name. The story we're going to hear from now is a gut-wrenching story. It is one that is not easy for Alyssa and her father to present to us. As I told them before, I told Alyssa before, any tears that are shed on Yom Kippur, whether it's during Yizkor or during the prayers or during this speech, are holy tears. There's nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed. This is not just a speech, this is a prayer. So Alyssa and Ken are going to give their best job to present what is a gut-wrenching, for them has even been illuminating, for they even learned things in the course of this process that they did not fully understand or fully gather. And I invite you to listen carefully to their story, particularly the story of their grandparents and parent and aunt who survived the Holocaust. So without further ado, I invite Alyssa and Ken to come forward.
All four of my grandparents survived the Holocaust. On one hand, they were fortunate to survive. On the other, they were plagued by this horrific nightmare for the rest of their lives. They had lost their first spouses and children, in addition to their extended families. My parents, my sister, and I are the product of their attempt to start over and create a new life for themselves. I believe it is my duty to tell the story of those who survived. Our parents weren't allowed to speak of the Holocaust. It was taboo in my family. My father will tell you what that was like in his home. We are getting uncomfortably close to a time when the Holocaust will cease to be a living memory and will become history. So it falls on us to assume the responsibility of telling their stories. The generation that follows us will no longer be able to hear these events from those who live them, but will have to read about them in textbooks. I never knew much of my mother's parents' story of survival. Jacob and Bella were their names and are deceased now. All I know of Jacob is that he lived in the Lodz ghetto with his wife and 2 daughters. His wife and 2 daughters were killed. Bella had a husband and a daughter that were killed. When Bella came to visit me 3 years ago, I asked her what her daughter's name was. She just shook her head and didn't answer. I was very close to my Nana Bella. What would I do to hear that thick Eastern European accent again? The same accent that used to embarrass me when I was a child. She ate food that was spoiled, wore the same clothing for decades, and never spent a dime on herself. But as frugal as she was with herself, that was how generous she was with her family. Bella's eyes were crooked, and as a child, that scared me. Only later did I learn that she was hit over the head so hard by the SS that her eyes were permanently damaged. A scar she showed me was a bullet wound. Looking back on the differences between Bella and the other grandmothers, I couldn't be prouder of her courage. When my mother passed away unexpectedly 5 years ago, any hope of hearing more of their story was gone. My father's parents, Anne and Joe, recorded their stories in the 1980s. Nana Ann survived because of a brave Gentile family that hid her on a farm. Then she hid in a catacomb surrounded by darkness and dead bodies. Eventually, she obtained a fake birth certificate and got a job in the home of an aristocrat, often hanging up Nazis' coats. My Papa Joe narrated his story so it could be written as well as videotaped. He didn't write a story so it could sit in a drawer. So I'm here today to share his story with you. My father, Dr. Ken Berger, is here today to share with you what it was like growing up in his home with his two parents, having survived the Holocaust.
Good Yontif. The tragic experiences of survivors are now only emerging because for many years survivors refused to talk about them. They were especially silent to their own children. They maintained that they didn't want to relate the awful events that they survived in order to spare their children even vicarious pain. As my daughter just alluded to, discussions of the Holocaust was taboo in our home. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, I vividly recall Mom getting up many nights from a sound sleep, screaming and yelling and having profuse sweats and heart palpitations, obviously reliving her painful past memories and tragedies and horrors of what she experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not even part of the medical vocabulary in those days, in the 50s. As a preteen and teen, I focused on school, having been sent to a yeshiva in the primary grades, and I played stickball and basketball and football and idolized people like Mickey Mantle and Elvis and the Beatles. After my bar mitzvah, I entered high school and I learned about World War II in history class, especially about the Nazi invasion and occupations between 1939 and 1945, and the atrocities perpetrated against the Jews. When I asked my mom and dad to tell me about their history and experience in Europe and Poland, I was told, we lived in Poland and then came to America with you and your sister to have a better life. That's all you need to know. After repeated insistence and after learning that the Jews of Poland were either killed, tortured, starved, placed in forced labor camps, concentration camps, death camps, I again implored my parents to reveal their experience of how they survived, and as painful as it may be, to revisit those horrific years. I explained that they not only owed it to their kids, but they also owed it to society to never allow this kind of thing to ever happen again, so that their past doesn't become someone else's future. When the other survivors came forth and made their painful testimony public, I again told my parents to reveal their secret or be plagued with another form of torture, the incessant pestering by their teenage son, forever and ever. They finally got the message, and after what seemed to be an eternity, they succumbed to the pressure and revealed what had happened, how their previous families were murdered, and how they survived, and the legacy they left behind. My mom died in 1996 at 78, and Dad passed on in 1999 at the age of 92. I had videotaped their stories, which is enshrined in the archives of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the 7 or so pages of Dad's oral testimony, which was handwritten by my sister and myself, and is in my father's own words, and is truly an amazing story. Alyssa is going to recite that. I believe Rabbi actually saw the video to associate a face with the voice, with the words. When I asked Dad how it all began, he simply said that he heard one day there was a Jew hater named Adolf Hitler who came into power, and the propaganda against the Jews became widespread. But most people didn't take it too seriously. This was in Poland. He said, Ken, imagine, if you will, and he pointed outside, that one day on all the telephone poles and lampposts, there were flyers that said, effective tomorrow, all Jews must be off the street in their homes by 6 o'clock, or else pay the consequences of violating the government-imposed curfew. Then on another day, it said, all Jews must leave their home and relocate to a designated area, a quarantined area known as the ghetto. Essentially, all liberties were confiscated. It's very difficult for Americans to even fathom this kind of loss of civil rights and dignity. More amazingly, in just this past year, it was revealed to me and my family that my mother, with whom I was very close, had a husband, not my father, and a 3-year-old daughter. No one ever mentioned of this fact about a previous husband or a previous family. A word of that was never uttered to me, my brother, and my sister. A cousin named Erna, a retired college professor from Ohio and who authors textbooks utilized throughout many of the colleges in the United States and who now lives in Boca Raton, Florida, distinctly remembers visiting my mother with her then husband and her daughter, who was described as having Shirley Temple-type curls in the Lvov ghetto. This was shocking to me, as my mom told me I was her first child. And I only learned about it this year. How she kept this secret all these years simply astounds me. And she took this secret literally to her grave. Every survivor, and there are very few left, has a unique, powerful, and moving story. I often ask myself, as I'm sure many other second-generation Holocaust survivors do, if I would have been strong enough or determined enough to do what my own parents did. The courage and survival instincts that they demonstrated is beyond what I can comprehend. My father's story will now be delivered by my eldest daughter, Alyssa, of whom I'm extremely proud, to be so moved by her family's history to want to share this with the congregation on this of holiest of days, Yom Kippur. This very privilege of gathering together in the eyes of God to ask for forgiveness, for health and happiness, was not a luxury given to Eastern European Jews some 70 years ago. I now give you my daughter, Alyssa.
My name is Joseph David Berger. I was born in Poland in the city of Lemberg. The population was 500,000 people. Before the war broke out, there were 200,000 Jews in Lemberg. When the war was over, there were about 200 Jews left. I grew up with my 2 older brothers in a well-to-do family. My family was in the lumber business for generations. I had a very good upbringing. I finished public school through high school and was ready to enroll in college. During my high school years, there were 5 hours of Christian religious studies a week. I was the only Jew in my class. The rest of the kids were Christian. Since I didn't want to be bored doing nothing, I remained in the class with my Gentile friends. I attended class and studied the Christian religion. After school, my parents sent me to a rabbi to study Jewish and Hebrew. When I was older, I married a nice girl from a nice family. I became a father to 2 girls, Yanina and Selena, whom I adored very much. In the beginning, from 1939 to 1941, the Jewish people of Lemberg had no information that families, men, women, and children were being killed. We didn't believe the rumors. Then we started to read signs that every Jew must wear a yellow band on our arm, otherwise we'll be shot. The borders of the city and occupied territory by the Russians were closed. In 1940, we started getting information about the shipping of Jews from Eastern Europe and parts of Germany to concentration camps. Everything we owned was confiscated by the Germans: our homes, property, businesses, and furnishings. All Jewish people were forced to move out of their homes to the ghetto. The ghetto was built in a very short time with fences and gates on a 10-block street. The SS police and Gestapo warned the people not to leave the ghetto except to go to work accompanied by the police. We were slaves. In the beginning, it was very hard. Food was in short supply and medical supplies were hard to get. Every family of 4 to 6 people were confined to one room. The ghetto was administered by the Judenrat, who were assigned by the Germans. Often Judenrat administrators were Jews who worked for the SS. The Judenrat would get instructions from the police to deliver certain amounts of money, or 500 Jews would be killed. This happened often. They milked money and valuables from the Jews and started other tactics to terrorize them. The Judenrat grabbed women, children, elderly, and sick people that couldn't work for the Germans in the work camp to be taken away, to be killed. In 1943, it became very, very bad. Nobody was safe. We heard many cases of the Germans making men dig their own graves before killing them. We started to believe the atrocities we were hearing every day, and nobody knew what the next day would bring. We were living worse than animals. People that remained in the ghetto started getting sick with tuberculosis and dysentery and other diseases. A lot of people were dying in the ghetto from lack of food and medical care. The streets of the ghetto were covered with dead bodies, bodies swollen of hunger, children, infants, adults. Life in the ghetto was unbearable. We kept hoping and praying for better days. Day by day, conditions grew worse. We started building shelters under the earth, hoping that this will save our lives, but it was hopeless. I was strong and healthy, and they kept asking me to work on the airfield because I was an expert in the lumber business. Working outside the ghetto helped me to buy food for my family. Often I was able to exchange clothing and valuables with some of my Gentile customers I used to know to help me. In the city, I knew a lot of Christian people. One man, a director of a furniture factory, and I decided to build a shelter behind his office building for my wife and 2 daughters. Of course, I had to pay him. My older daughter, Yanina, was 8 at the time, and the baby, Selena, was close to 3. At the last minute, this director told me that he was afraid to hold the small child and hide her. The older daughter understood the situation, but Selena would cry, and he could lose his life and his family's lives. There were signs advising everyone that any Gentile who hit a Jew would be shot on the spot. I began thinking and worrying about what to do. During this time, an important point to make is that there was an accident. My 3-year-old daughter, Selena, grabbed a pot of hot milk from the stove and got a 2nd-degree burn on her upper right leg. I overcame this tragedy by healing her with oil, and the burn became better. I was still wondering what to do with my younger daughter. I got in touch with some peasants from a small village, my previous customers. I decided to save my daughter's life by leaving her with them for money. But the people started asking so many questions about the little girl, and they became scared. They brought back the child to the ghetto, taking my money, of course. A lot of peasants from these small villages would take the money and bring the children to the Gestapo headquarters to be killed. This man had some heart and brought my child back. After a few sleepless nights, I became desperate and decided on another system to save my little daughter's life. I used any means necessary to convince her she was not Jewish. I started to teach her name was not Selena, but Mary. Her daddy's name is Joseph, and her mommy's name is Mary. I put a cross on her chest and started hour by hour to teach her Christian prayers and how to behave in church. I learned all of this in high school in the religious hours from a priest. Little did I know at the time this could be saving my daughter's life. I used to wake her up in the middle of the night, making her memorize her name, her father's name, her mother's name, and the Christian prayers. After a few weeks of torturing her in the middle of the night, I succeeded. Finally, I started to think about how to save her life now that she was brainwashed. I decided that the next day my older daughter, Yanina, would take the little one out of the ghetto, escorted by me. They would take a streetcar to a big park in a strictly Gentile neighborhood. I remember this was a Friday. My older daughter, Yanina, my 3-year-old Selena, and I left the ghetto early in the morning with clear instructions for me to take the streetcar to the park. There they were to play with the other children, and when it started to get dark at 7 p.m., Yanina was to leave her sister in the park, playing with the children, and she was to return to the ghetto. I would be waiting for Yanina by the ghetto door. Yanina came crying to me that evening that she lost her sister. The next day, I read in a local newspaper that a 3-year-old little girl was found in the park crying. She said her name was Mary. Anyone claiming the little girl is to pick her up in an all-Gentile neighborhood called Makotier Street, number 6. They are to ask for the super's wife. I was glad to find out that she was safe and decided to forget about her for the time being. Every day I would go to work escorted by the SS police. I told my wife and older daughter not to worry about me. In case the ghetto should be cleaned out of the remaining Jews, that she should take the child, Yanina, and go into hiding in the shelter that I built for them. I told them not to worry about me. I had an intuition that with God's help, I would be saved. Shortly, in about a week while at work, we were told to stop working. They began loading us on cattle wagons. We spent a whole week on the cattle wagon with no food or hygienic facilities. Many people died. With God's help, somehow I survived this horrific trip. 5,000 men, women, and children were brought to Buchenwald at this one time. 56,545 people were murdered in Buchenwald alone. Upon arrival at Buchenwald, they gave us a piece of bread and water. They stamped my armband number 86969. They kept having meetings with the SS police and Gestapo and told us that everybody must listen to them, that we were inmates in the camp. Everyone must put all the gold, jewelry, money, and valuables they had left in the 100 garbage bags that they had prepared for us. Before the speeches were finished, we heard 10 shots from pistols nearby. 10 or more people were killed. They announced on the loudspeaker that anyone found hiding any valuables in their clothing would be shot on the spot. These murderers had 100 garbage bags full of valuables in 1 hour. Then they had us sitting on the cold grass all night, and in the morning we were searched. I cannot begin to describe the terror and humiliation that I saw there. This was our first day in Buchenwald. In the morning, 10 Gestapo guards and many SS officers with machine guns showed up. They began separating us into 2 groups, those moving to the right and those going to the left. The left line was to be gassed within an hour, and to the right were stronger, healthier people. I was told to go to the right. I was relieved temporarily. They asked me what my profession is, and I told them I am a specialist in lumber and carpentry. The first day in camp, they segregated the women, men, and children in separate barracks. We were forced to stand in line for soup and coffee. The soup was plain water. As I am in line, people were being shot right in front of me. I recognized many familiar faces of doctors, lawyers, and professors from my hometown standing in line and getting abused and punished severely. I saw people with swollen bodies and faces because of insufficient food. I cannot describe the misery and degradation of these people. We lived worse than animals. They sent me to work in the forest. There we made friends with many Christians who helped us with food and many necessary things. After 6 weeks of Buchenwald, some of us were sent to Lemberg Lager. The SS needed those who were able to make barrels for their sauerkraut and pickles. I raised my hand and said I was a specialist in lumber. When I got back to Lemberg, I was temporarily happy because I found many Christian workers that helped me a little in the past. I thought I would see my wife and my older daughter, Janina. However, in Lemberg, I received information that my wife and older daughter left to go to the shelter. On the way, they were shot by the Ukrainian police. I became very depressed. Only the memory that my little daughter, Selena, still lives gave me the courage to go on. After being in Lemberg for 2 months, the Gestapo called a meeting. Everybody who is a specialist in lumber must come forward. Those who are not specialists in lumber and come forward will be shot. The lumber must be very clean. 10 people and myself were escorted to the lumber factory 7 miles from the city. It was a very hot day in July. I worked all day making barrels. One day when the SS officer was satisfied, he threw me a cigarette from his mouth and told me I can rest. As I was resting and washing myself with cold water, I got a surge of energy. I got the idea to run away. The lumber factory had a chain link fence around it with a small entry gate with 2 SS men standing watch. That moment, I decided to run for the gate and escape to the woods. It was about 10 feet from the gate to the edge of the woods. I pushed the 2 SS men to the ground and ran. They started shooting at me, and I felt a stabbing pain in my left foot as I got hit with 2 bullets, one just above the knee. Just after I was shot, it started raining cats and dogs. I was very lucky because the SS guards stopped chasing me. Here I was in the forest, bleeding and without a place to go and no food. I ripped up my shirt, bandaged my leg, and kept running. I remembered my previous customers, the small town people and peasants. By the time I reached the houses, it was dark. I began begging for bread and money. Nobody wanted to give me shelter. They only gave me food and money and sent their dogs after me, making me run. I did this for 2 months, living in the forest, going from house to house. Finally, after sleeping in the forest, I remembered that one of the peasants owed me money. He was always crying that he needed money for his wife's doctor. I helped him in the past before the war. John was this man's name, and he helped me a little with food and money. People began telling me that a lot of Gentile refugees were coming from Wolimir, a small village in southwest Poland, and getting food cards and identification passports. You had to have 2 witnesses. I was very desperate living by myself in the forest with no identification papers. I must mention that I was blonde and looked Aryan, and my vocabulary had no Jewish accent. One morning, I asked John to go with me to the Gestapo and be my witness so I could get Gentile papers. In the beginning, he hesitated, but he finally agreed to go with me. In the morning, we went to the city. Standing in line at the Gestapo headquarters, I found another witness. He was a drunk, but would do to get my papers. I finally got my papers and kissed Johnny goodbye. My name on the paper said Joseph Konopnicki. I left for the railroad station. I was stopped by a Jewish capo. This is a policeman working and getting paid by the Gestapo to find Jews. I showed him my papers. He didn't believe me. He really knew me from the city. He began pushing me to a door of a nearby house. He wanted me to drop my pants to prove I was not Jewish. I became scared and kicked him with all my might. He fell to the ground and I ran as fast as I could. I bought a ticket for the train and caught it just as it was moving out of the station. After riding on the train, I arrived in a village outside the city of Krakow. Getting off the train, I realized that it must be Sunday. Everybody was dressed up and going to church. I came upon a Christian monastery, rang the bell, said the Christian greeting, and told them I was hungry. They told me to go to church and pray. After church, they gave me breakfast. I was there 2 weeks chopping wood and cleaning. After 2 weeks, I went to the registrar's office to get a food card and a job. As I showed them my papers, I was worried that someone would recognize me and that I would be shot to death. I got a job working in a lumber yard. One day, somebody at work said I worked slow like a Jew. I was afraid and went to the next small town called Langkut. I then went to see the principal of the school there and asked him for help. He gave me a job instructing children who were slow in arithmetic and sent me to a widow for sleeping quarters. The widow was a very nice woman, and in my spare time, I helped her 2 daughters study. The widow's name was Mrs. Ryder. Every night she had a brother-in-law who would come over. He didn't seem to like me and the fact that I was staying there. One day I came in and greeted everybody, but Mrs. Ryder wouldn't answer. After a few minutes, I finally found out that she had gotten an anonymous letter that Joseph Konopnicki, that was my assumed name, is a Polish officer from camp and will be reported to the Gestapo. I was really scared. The night after Christmas was cold, and I heard horses and people outside the door and said the Gestapo was coming for Joseph Konopnicki. These people were partisans from the hills. They covered my eyes, gave me warm clothes, put me on a horse, and we were riding all night. In the morning, the partisans and I came to a place that had about 2,000 Polish soldiers. They put me on a line and asked everybody if they knew me. After everybody answered negatively, I was brought back to the village. The guy who sent the letter was killed. That night, I left the village. I was wandering from village to village working. Anytime people accused me of looking or acting like a Jew, I would leave everything and go to the next town. I was looking to get to the partisans. If nobody knows you, they are afraid to enroll you. I was wandering around looking 100 times dead in the eyes for 2 years and survived until the end of the war. I was liberated by the Russians and became a Polish officer in the army. I wore the Polish army uniform, and my job was to deliver food to the army in the front line. Then I started to look for my little daughter, Selena, who was now Mary. After coming to the city of Lemberg on Makotier Street, I went to the nearby apartment building mentioned in the newspaper from years before. I asked the janitor's wife about my little girl. I finally got the right answer. That night, the woman was in the park with her grandchild. She saw a little girl crying and took pity on her and took her home. On the way home, she got frightened, thinking that maybe this was a Jewish girl. When she came to the building, she left the child on the stairs in the hallway. The child was tired and hungry and soon fell asleep on the stairs. It was very late at night, and an aristocratic Polish woman named Mrs. Sowiecki, who lived on the 3rd floor, was coming home. As she was walking up the stairs, she accidentally kicked the child, not having seen her, and the child started to cry. Having pity, the woman took the child into her apartment. When neighbors began seeing the child with her, they began asking questions. She cared for the child very much, and one day she left her apartment and disappeared. Nobody knew where. It took me 6 months to locate relatives of this woman. Nobody was willing to give me any information. Finally, after questioning neighbors, I found out that this woman had a brother who was a bishop at a monastery deep in the mountains. I got acquainted with a Russian highway policeman, and he agreed to go with me to search. We traveled to the mountains where this monastery was. We were not allowed to go inside. That was the law. One day, I was standing beside the gate. A little girl was picking up wood for the fireplace. I asked her name, and she said her name was Mary. I recognized her. This was my daughter. She was then about 6 years old. However, the child didn't want to talk to me. My heart was broken. What was I going to do? After a while, I took off my uniform. I thought this may be scaring her. After I changed into street clothing, I rang the bell at the monastery. I told them I had a donation to deliver. Once inside, I told them that I had lost my daughter in the war, that I am a devoted Christian, and I was ready to pay any amount of money to the church charity. The nuns and the bishop were called. They said this child was not mine, that she is the daughter of the bishop's sister. I insisted telling them that this was my child, but I couldn't convince them. I told them about the burn scar she had on her right thigh. They picked up the skirt and found the scar. Still, they wouldn't give up the child. They said there was nothing they could do. It was not enough evidence that this child was mine. I was desperate. I didn't know what to do. I saw when the kids would come out to play. Every day I came to the gate to watch Mary for a week. Finally, one afternoon, I brought a Jewish friend in the Russian army to the monastery. We decided to kidnap her. It was the only way. The monastery fence was 6 feet high. I saw her feeding some chicks. I put chloroform on her face and threw my daughter over the fence to my friend. We got into the Jeep and we drove away as fast as we could. Now my problems were only starting. Mary would cry all day and night calling for her mother. She wouldn't eat and cried that I wasn't her father. The nuns Mary knew were her family. I took her with me all over, begging people to take care of her. I couldn't get the child to stop crying. I went to the doctor, but no one could help me. Mary cried herself to sleep every night. I was desperately trying to find someone to comfort my baby, promising them money, food, clothing, etc., but nobody wanted to take care of a very sick child that was crying all day and night. Nobody helped me until I met the woman who would be my new wife, Anne, who took Mary as her own, and with whom I had 2 sons after the war, Kenneth and Jerry. That's the end of Joe's story in his words. Anne, whose one family was extinguished, offered to care for Mary as if she were her own. And together with their son, Kenny, my father, embarked on the SS Ernie Pyle to find a new life in America, presumably where being a Jew was not a crime. The trek over the ocean was an attempt of forgetting or trying to forget their unconscionable, horrific